Hello and welcome to Counting the Earth from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm Alice Ho.
And I'm Sue Nelson. Today we're recording somewhere rather special, as the focus of this podcast episode is on a tropical plant. So where better to come than the enormous white glass domed palm house in the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in West London. And what you can hear, can't you, in the background, Alice, is somebody watering some of these beautiful palms. And it's lovely to come in out of the spring cold as well.
Absolutely, it is quite a fresh day today, but we're here in the palm house where it's a lovely 20 degrees and around 70 to 80% humidity, so very different to outside. And we're here to visit one of its more complex residents, Elaeis guineensis, the African oil palm. Regular listeners will know that for each episode we delve into stories from the environment and the natural world, but always through the lens of one number. And today's number reflects how commercially important oil palm is, specifically its fruit, with 80 million tonnes of palm oil expected to be produced globally this year. And that's a figure that just keeps rising.
As a crop, it's both hugely productive and versatile, but because of the vast destruction of rainforest habitats in the 1990s to clear land for palm plantations in Southeast Asia, it's also hugely controversial. And in this episode, we'll dig into these two sides of palm and explore how to grow it in a more environmentally friendly way that can benefit the local communities, not just the plantation giants.
Coming up, we'll speak to UKCEH scientists and the founder of Wild Asia about their joint research into a more sustainable way of growing oil palm. And we'll look at the future of oil palm in Africa as well.
We're also under Heathrow's flight path, which is why we've occasionally got the sound of planes. With us is Will Spolstra, the palm house manager. You've taken a break from watering some of the plants. Before we do anything, let's just pay tribute to this incredible building. It's got sort of two long sides. We're underneath a sort of domed part of it with greenery and foliage just all over the place. How did this structure actually come about? It's quite old, isn't it, as a greenhouse?
Yeah, well, this is the oldest of the great glass houses at Kew. It's really one of the iconic features, and it's a real centrepiece. It's one of the first things people see when they come in. It's an amazing glass house. It's incredible architecture, which was first built in the 1840s, taking a lot of influence from techniques that were used in the shipbuilding industry. It was first built really to hold what was an ever-growing collection of tropical plants, many palms especially.
Now, you mentioned shipbuilding industry. This curved bit, that's supposed to be like an upturned hull, is that right?
Yeah, so from the outside, especially if you look at it from the distance, it does somewhat resemble the upturned hull of a ship. And these curves really were brought about by the introduction and use of wrought iron, which enabled the long curved beams at the top without the need for so many pillars. So there's more space for the plants to grow into.
It's over 180 years old, this greenhouse. I notice at the top there, obviously due to the humidity, you've got a lot of rust on these iron girders. Is it showing its age?
It's due another renovation. The last one took place in the late 1980s. So the ironwork isn't in terrible condition, but it does need some reinforcement and some repairs. All of the glass is due to be replaced. And we're also going to move to a more sustainable heating system.
And you're going to be taking some of the plants into temporary accommodation while that happens, including, I believe, the oil palm, is that right?
Yes, so all of the plants in the house have to be removed. In total, there's not far off 1,000 different species in here. Some of these will be lifted from the beds, containerised, and moved into a temporary decant glass house. The oil palm is one of the palms that we've had kept in a container the last few years. We have previously grown it in beds in the house where it's grown right to the top of a glass house. We currently have a small one in a container in a decant house, which will be planted when the house reopens.
Great. Shall we go and find our palm's new digs then?
Sure, let's go and have a look. We're just entering the temporary decant glass house, which was built for the palm house renovation.
We've got lots and lots of different trees and other plants in pots here. Which one is our oil palm?
Just over here on the other side of the glass house. And here we go. This is the oil palm.
It's quite a young one, isn't it? It's about 3 metres high, because these can get really tall, can't they?
These can grow up to around 20 metres tall. So this is still what you might call a juvenile palm. It's yet to really develop a trunk. Once that does, that trunk can grow up to quite a height.
It originated in Africa, didn't it? But they grow a different variety on the big plantations in Southeast Asia. So which one is this?
This is the African oil palm. This is native to a lot of West Africa as well as Central Africa, but it's very commonly cultivated in the moist tropical regions and probably most extensively in Southeast Asia.
And where does the oil come from? Because I'm assuming we haven't got any fruits at this point because this is too young a plant.
Yeah, exactly. This is still a juvenile plant. It's not mature enough to develop flowers and fruits yet. Fruits come from short inflorescences which develop in between the lower leaves, and that will bear clusters of fruit. And it's from the actual flesh of the fruit as well as from the seed that you can get the oil.
Started in Africa, but it's now a huge global crop, as our headline number demonstrates, with around 80 million tonnes expected to be produced globally this year. What's palm oil actually used for?
There's two types of palm oil, really. There's the palm oil itself, which you get from the flesh of a fruit, which might be used in a number of food products, as well as industrial products and lubricants, that kind of thing. You've also got the oil from the seed, which is known as kernel oil, which again might be used in food products like margarine, but also in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals.
This particular type of oil palm, this African one, they've got the hybrid one in Southeast Asia. And there's a sort of difference in yield, isn't it? You get less from this one than you do from the Southeast Asian one.
So this is the just straight species, Similaeus guineensis. You'll get palm oil from this, but there are hybrids used in the monocultures that you might see in Southeast Asia that produce a higher yield. And it's those that are used for this kind of mass production of palm oil.
We have had a great introduction to oil palm there. Thank you very much, Will Spolstra, manager of the Palm House at Kew. In our quest to understand how oil palm can be grown more sustainably, we spoke to Dr. Yulia Drewer, head of Atmosphere-Biosphere Interactions at UKCEH, and her colleague, principal scientist Professor Neil McNamara. We began by asking Neil how their teams came to be researching oil palm in Southeast Asia in the first place.
We first became interested in oil palm over a decade ago. We were working on large consortium projects out in Borneo, Malaysia, looking at tropical forest deforestation and impacts on a variety of ecosystem functions. In my case, I was looking at soil carbon dynamics. Whilst in the UK, we had research which was exploring how to sustainably roll out bioenergy crops, such as miscanthus and willow, into the UK landscape. And there was a meeting of two concepts, really, one around tropical forest deforestation, one about sustainable crop intensification. And the two elements really came together. For me, oil palm is a really interesting one. It sits at a crossroads. So on one hand, we know that it has very poor environmental credentials in relation to a lot of historic land use change and deforestation. But on the other hand, we also know that it is a hugely productive crop. It's a super crop. Oil palm currently produces 40% of the world's vegetable oil, yet it is only planted on 6% of land that's allocated to vegetable oil crops. And what this really means is that if we were to move away from oil palm, we would need to expand other vegetable oil crops by 4 to 10 times in terms of land area required. And this could have knock-on implications, not only for forest carbon storage, biodiversity, in a range of different locations across the world. So our ethos is really about trying to do better with what we have in terms of converted oil palm lands. And there's huge opportunities to improve the efficiency and sustainability, which is a major focus of our research.
And did you learn from them as well?
Absolutely. In terms of regenerative agriculture, which is a very big issue now in the UK, a lot of the approaches out in Southeast Asia have more regenerative focus, especially in smallholder systems where they do not have access to more intensive management approaches.
How much of the oil palm grown in the areas that you study is grown by smallholders? Because I always imagine those kind of vast oil palm plantations.
In terms of smallholder oil palm plantations, in Southeast Asia, it's roughly about 40%. These can be anything from independent smallholders that have a very small piece of land, all the way up to other smallholders that might be part of cooperatives linked to mills. And along that supply chain, they have different abilities to make money from their crop, with the independent ones being the most limited in accessing good supply chains.
We know 80 million tonnes of palm oil is expected to be produced this year, but obviously only a smaller subset of that is by smallholders. So what are the productivity and environmental challenges that these smallholders face, Julia?
Their productivity is often about 50% lower than that of large estates. Some of it is because they don't have the same access to fertilizers and other inputs to the plantations as these large corporations have. They also have not direct access to mills, so they rely on middlemen to transport their crop to the mill to get pressed for oil. But the main issue really is this yield gap, and that represents a significant opportunity to improve yields on existing land rather than expanding cultivation further. Some of the problems with using lower quality fertilizers or applying fertilizers in excess can increase environmental impacts, including degraded soil health and higher greenhouse gas emissions. And our research, conducted in partnership with Wild Asia in Malaysia, focuses on addressing this issue.
What are the challenges around soil quality that smallholders and farmers actually have in Malaysia?
Soil health is part of a bigger challenge for smallholder farmers. We really need to think about plantation health and how to manage the overall system. When we think about the challenges for smallholder farmers, a very big one is limited agronomic skills relative to larger companies for actually growing the crop. Labor is a huge issue now. Younger families are moving out of rural areas into cities. So there's a labour gap. Smallholder farmers have very poor cultivars of varieties of oil palm as well to grow, which can limit productivity. As Julia's mentioned, a big issue is fertilizer strategies. Our work is really trying to see whether we can help farmers move away from synthetic, expensive fertilizers and use alternatives, and in particular composts and also biochar. And the compost can be used as a nutrient replacement, while the biochar can also help hold nutrients in these soils. And a major soil health challenge within these tropical systems are that these acid-weathered soils can leach nutrients very, very easily. And biochar, which is a charcoal, as a soil health improver, has been shown to hold on to those nutrients, making them plant available. One of the things we're doing at the moment in collaboration with Wild Asia is exploring whether we can substitute out synthetic fertilizers. So we have experiments across 10 plantations in peninsular Malaysia where we're testing business as usual synthetic fertilization, synthetic fertilizer that's reduced in the amount with composts, and our final treatment is reduced synthetic fertilizer with compost and biochar. And with that final treatment, we're really hoping that the biochar will help retain nutrients, and this will feed back into plant productivity and soil health.
Will it extend beyond oil palm? It almost sounds like it could be a magic bullet, but I'm assuming that's not the case.
It's definitely not a magic bullet. It is amazing how much research has come out of recent to show there are a lot of benefits of biochar, from nutrient retention, greenhouse gas reduction, buffering against drought. But it's always context dependent. It depends where you put the biochar, when you put it there, and also the type of biochar. So it's not a magic bullet, but it's part of our toolkit. But it does appear, and this comes from our other research we've been doing as well, that tropical soils are very responsive to biochar additions. In terms of yield increases, the literature tells us that you're more likely to see a benefit in a tropical area compared to temperate zones.
As well as looking at soil health and soil content, this trial also looked at measuring greenhouse gas emissions from these fields, and the samples came back to UKCEH. So what are the processes that increase greenhouse gas emissions in these fields, and how do we hope that this work will reduce those emissions?
In agricultural systems in general, not just oil palm, it is the use of fertilizers that leads to the release of greenhouse gases, particularly one called nitrous oxide, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, about 300 times more powerful than CO2. Research shows that certain soil amendments, such as the biochar and the compost, can help to reduce emissions when they replace part of these conventional chemical fertilizers. And in our current field experiment with Wild Asia, we are measuring greenhouse gas emissions from applied biochar and compost alongside traditional chemical fertilizers, allowing us to directly compare their effects within the same plantation.
How is it that you actually collect these greenhouse gases?
We're using a technique called static flux chambers. In a previous project, we have trained Wild Asia staff to take measurements using these static flux chambers in the field, and we had also provided them with the equipment back then, and we are reusing it for this project, which highlights the longer term nature of our collaboration and applicability across kind of different types of projects.
Now, you mentioned a static flux chamber there. I'm assuming that this is some instrument that measures your emissions. How does it actually work?
The flux chambers are not measuring, they're trapping gases from the soil. So they're basically like a little box or a bucket that we would place on the soil. And at regular intervals, we are taking air samples out of this enclosed space. And these air samples are then shipped back to our laboratory here at UKCEH and analyzed in the lab here. And we measure a buildup of certain greenhouse gases.
I got it. And that's how you know that nitrous oxide is emitted so much more than carbon dioxide.
Yeah, because nitrogen is the main nutrient that plants need in agriculture. So all fertilizers, whether they are organic or synthetic, contain nitrogen. And when the nitrogen gets into the soil microbes convert it into plant available nutrients, but part of it is released as nitrous oxide, which is this potent greenhouse gas.
I know this is just a short study, but I think we've got some initial data.
From the ongoing field experiments, we have in fact just received the last batch of samples to analyze in the lab. But we have some results from previous laboratory studies where we used soil from Malaysian oil palm plantations and added some biochar to them. And those experiments showed some promising results in that the biochar has the potential to reduce these nitrous oxide emissions in comparison to just chemical fertilizers. And we have also done some other experiments looking at the environmental impacts of oil palm plantations. So, for example, in some plantations, they left vegetation grow under the palm trees, increasing biodiversity in the plantation. And we also planted some natural forest around the small streams and rivers in plantations, creating something called a riparian forest. They're basically biodiversity buffers as well, increasing biodiversity by introducing other species than just the oil palm. And our measurements in those projects have shown that while biodiversity is increasing in these plantations and in the whole landscape, the greenhouse gas burden didn't increase. So overall, that had a positive impact on the environment.
Neil, what are your thoughts on the biochar experiment so far?
Well, we're coming to the end of our experiment midway through 2026, but I guess the success of the work thus far is that we've managed to actually install experiments at 10 different plantations in Malaysia, and we've made that fully operational now. This experiment is a demonstrator of what's possible. Once we've generated the results and shared them, we'll seek future funding and hopefully underpin wider scale adoption of these techniques of incorporating biochar with compost, which we think has huge potential in the smallholder context. By doing things like this, if we're actually able to scale up, this can help smallholders in terms of productivity. It can ease pressure on forests and ultimately feed into making oil palm a more sustainable product, which is part of the work we want to achieve.
Our thanks go to Dr. Julia Drewer and Professor Neil McNamara of UKCEH. And we're back now in the relatively warm and humid conditions of the massive palm house in the Royal Botanic Gardens.
You heard both Neil and Julia mention Wild Asia. We spoke to Wild Asia's founder and executive director, Reza Azmi, and I began by asking him how oil palm, an African plant, came to be grown in Southeast Asia.
Partly to do with colonial empires. That's the short answer. Palm in Africa was grown in villages and it was used by local communities. The other part of this history relates to slavery, because the trade between the Americas, Africa, and the UK was partly to do with the movement of people. But you would start to see the story of industrialization, because when it was no longer acceptable to trade in people, the traders and the government, who depend on trade as a major source of income, in some ways we're thinking, well, what else can we trade? And it was a fella in Liverpool that said that maybe we could turn these oils into soap. And this was the beginning of the industrialization of palm that was, I think it's like mid 1800s. It didn't get into Southeast Asia till a little bit later. Part of this was then looking for new areas where we could expand oil palm. And from there, it started to be experimented as a plantation crop. Subsequently, we had plant breeding and different things. So actually, the oil palm that you see in industrial plantations today is a relative of the original palm that was sitting in these villages in Africa.
Gosh, well, that got very dark very quickly, didn't it?
I think this is it. You could hear from my accent, like I studied in England. It was only later that I started to realize how much of an influence this trade colonial model has had on the world today. And then you start realizing that it's the trade model that has been flawed.
You're right. Well, trade changes society. It changes what we use for crops, what you put worth on and what doesn't. And this sudden emergence of palm oil within that region, plantations in Indonesia, here it's considered controversial. Are there safeguards in place now to protect the land from cutting down trees in order to grow the palm oil?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we also have to remember is that this industrialization was in some ways a good thing because it was generating value. And then you find that palm was used in so many different types of products. When I started working almost 20 odd years, so all of those areas that you see that are palm today, a lot of those were actually forest reserves. And those forest reserves were a resource that has been utilized in a very crazy way since the 1960s. So, this question around what are the safeguards for deforestation today? In Malaysia, a lot of land is pretty stable in the sense that there's no real recent expansion into forest reserves, nowhere as near as what we saw in terms of those conversions in the 1980s and the 1990s. The worst places in terms of deforestation are now in some of these fringe areas in Papua. To me, I think like this expansion is a bit scary because it's getting out to those areas where there's also very little governance. It's out of most people's mind's eye, and they're very far away places.
Something that I've seen on products in supermarkets, for example, is this certification of sustainable palm oil. So where do those certifications come from and how are they governed or managed?
The RSPO certification was, in terms of like history, it was around the same time as the Forest Steward Council, so FSC. So you remember, like, everything is tied into first people were thinking of good forest management. Then, unfortunately, most of those forests were now in oil palm. So, how do we manage this expansion? And I think that transition meant that people started focusing on what does good oil palm management look like. And in some ways, this was led partly by some of the major brands like Unilever, groups like WWF, and some of the major producers in Malaysia. They got a movement of people together to say, well, let's define what is good sustainable palm oil, and let's see whether we can get this into the market so that if people are going to buy palm oil, then a labeled certified palm oil would be better than just any palm oil. So I think that's been the trend over the last 10 or 20 years. And in some ways, I guess I would not have done the work that I've done if it wasn't for this, because we were, at the front lines of this. We didn't work on policy, we worked in the field. And it was partly trying to think about if these standards are talking about social, environmental, and just kind of good agriculture practices, we have to make sure that we can educate the industry because this was important. So the frontliners need to know how to do these things. But if you think of, you talked to some figure in terms of volumes of palm oil being produced, there's only about 30-40% of all palm oil producers, from the mills, who are actually certified. So the vast majority of palm in the global supply base are uncertified. It's sort of hidden from most consumers' views because it's sitting as a chemical derivative. It's hidden in fuels that are maybe powering some biofuels, machinery, or things like that.
And in terms of the land that's given to all this oil palm production, quite a large part of it is given to smallholders.
In terms of production, if you're in Malaysia, for example, almost 30-40% of the total production would come from some form of independent small producer. Then the bulk of the rest of it would either be government schemes or corporate run estates. In some regions like Thailand, which is the third largest producer of oil palm, it's almost 90% smallholders. It's the complete opposite. You also find that smallholders there are very industrious in the sense that they're always looking for revenue stacking, so doing as many things on a small piece of land. And it contrasts really, really well with Malaysian, Indonesian smallholders. They're not earning as much, but they're sort of dependent on government schemes.
So particularly it sounds in Malaysia, the landscape is sort of designed by and set up by and for these big corporate players. A big part of the work that Wild Asia does and that you do is around helping those smallholder farmers survive in that landscape. Can you tell us a bit more about how you do that?
One of the fortuitous things, we got the opportunity to work with smallholders and to basically see how they could meet the RSPO certification. And this is what we started 10 years ago. What we realized was these individual smallholders don't follow a corporate blueprint. They were doing things differently and they weren't bad off. In fact, some of them were very profitable. So we started paying attention to this. And I think what we ended up with was kind of going back in time a little bit. If you look at, kind of agriculture 100 years ago, there was a heavy dependence on bringing organic matter back into the farms, having rotation cycles, and also like maybe literature about 100 plus years ago, this phrase, living soils, that sort of stuck with me. And we realized that if you compare soils in these diverse smallholder managed plots compared to the industrial plots, one is like a desert compared to this other one where you've got earthworms and other stuff going on in them. Good agriculture must be about how well we are treating the most important resource, which is soils. The biologist in me, obviously, I'm now fascinated by this. You realize it's the role of fungi and a lot of these microorganisms that we can't see. They are the most important building blocks for any ecosystem, whether it's the farm, whether it's the rivers, whether it's the seeds.
Oh, I agree. It's got to be a future podcast that we do on fungi because it's so interesting. UKCEH totally acknowledges the importance of soil, and we've done an entire podcast on how important soil is to everything else. Does your approach help with lowering the carbon impact of farming as well?
The relationship between the landowner and the soil is a really good indication of whether you're going to end up with a sustainable agriculture practice or not. And in the case of an industrial plantation, you've got very drastic land clearing in the very beginning, but then you're living with the debt that you started off with. If you can find existing agriculture versus forest, your carbon balance is obviously going to be better. The second thing is that the major source of emissions in the farm is going to be nitrous oxide. All that fertilizer use, your carbon emissions in a normal farm are going to be crazy. What we're finding in the smallholder plots is kind of like the opposite. They're not using as much fertilizer in the first place. So their emissions over time is actually rather small. So their footprint is small. Then we went one step further, which is let's eliminate fertilizers altogether. Let's build more diversity in your farm blocks. Let's ferment things and feed your bacteria and feed your fungi. And what does your carbon footprint look like today? And that's partly our relationship with UKCEH. We started to have these trials with the smallholders. And I went to one of the professors at UKCEH and I said, there must be a simpler way of doing this. Is there an alternative? But what I'm finding is that when you compare a bioblock, a biological system of agriculture versus a conventional block, the total emissions from a bioblock is almost on par with the secondary forests where we've got plots that we're monitoring at the same time. Although the difference is going to be obvious, it's sequestering more than the conventional plots that we're monitoring, also in smallholders. Clearly, we're seeing a direction. And if you can get it to be more on the carbon sink end, and that's going to be a good goal.
Part of your recent research with UKCEH has involved biochar. Why biochar?
I love these themes of going back in history and finding grandmother recipes or ways of doing agriculture that was something practiced thousands of years ago. One of this theme was what was happening in the Amazonias. It's called terra preta soil. Initially, people thought that this was like peat soils or something, until people started looking at what's actually going on inside. And that's when they discovered that these were just layers and layers of some sort of char or charcoal of some sort. The agriculture system of this 3,000-year-old method was all about bringing different forms of charcoal and different things back into the soils. So it's not like a barbecue where you end up with ash at the end of the day, but the process of pyrolysis is something where you can heat up your organic matter to a point where it carbonizes. Can only happen if you've got a low oxygen environment. It has these properties where it's heated up at a high enough temperature that it becomes something that can live in the soil for a long time. And when you look at this under an electron microscope, you start noticing that it's just made up of so many different pores that when it's in the soils, it increases the surface area for soil microorganisms to colonize and to live. So we figured out like how to get a process going. So we were producing small amounts of biochar. And obviously, when you apply this in a farm that's already thinking about cultivating soil microbes, it's going to help. That's interacting with your plants in a way, at that mycorrhizal level. So providing all the nutrients that the plants need in order to survive and live a healthy life. Part of our work was we had pure freedom to work with smallholders, and we can try different things. And then occasionally some of the UKCEH fellows would come and tell us something, and then we try and do it. But we didn't realize that along the way, this was building more evidence that this approach is better. It works. You're actually earning more money. You're getting better yields. You're improving pest resilience and all of these other things. So now it's exciting because now I'm taking this to the big estates. And partly where we need the support is people on the buying end of the spectrum to say, we would like to buy not just sustainable palm oil, but I'd like to buy your palm oil. And I want to put this in my products. We can then use this as a way to generate more support for this kind of method of agriculture, which is more in tune with what we want to see, like, get more of the waste back into the farms, transform the waste into microbial active products, real life circular economy stuff going on here. It's a really lovely ecosystem that we've created. We have almost no relationship with any UK buyers. But last year we secured some deals where we're working with some Japanese traders to actually do what I was imagining, which is buy from these mills who we work with, and this is now going to Japan. So I know it's possible, and it's kind of also nice knowing the history where we've come from. Although it started on a dark note, I do feel that we have to acknowledge this, because to transform palm, you have to know what is not working so that we don't just patch a broken model. The more I speak to different scientists, I realize that actually we're on the right path. It's just that knowledge is not so widely spread to the people who are making, agronomic decisions on big estates and stuff.
Our thanks to Reza Azmi. That was a really interesting insight that Neil, Yulia and Reza gave us into an aspect of oil palm we generally don't really hear about, colonialism.
Yes, it was quite an eye-opener, really. And I hadn't realised how ubiquitous oil palm was. And you can see the benefits of a product that can substitute for fossil fuels and can, in fact, reduce land use change because of its higher yields than other oil crops. It almost seems like a model plant, but of course we know there is another side, and we can't ignore the huge environmental destruction that land clearance for palm wreaked in the past and still threatens in some areas today. I've travelled quite extensively in Southeast Asia and have seen some of these huge plantations for myself, and they are monocultures of palm stretching off into the distance. And the use of chemical fertilizers, which emits greenhouse gases, and the lack of biodiversity on these big plantations, unfortunately, is not benefiting the environment at all.
It absolutely isn't. So hearing Rachael talk about his vision for a more sustainable palm, from using palm waste in a circular economy and investing naturally in the soil to growing other crops alongside, is all giving communities a way to invest in themselves. It was a really hopeful perspective on a crop that has an understandably poor reputation in the West.
Indonesia and Malaysia are both pretty saturated with oil palm plantations these days, large and small. But our story is about to go full circle, back to Africa where the plant originated. Once the hub of palm oil production in the early 20th century, it was soon overtaken by Southeast Asia. But growing the oil palm sector in Africa is on the rise once again.
UKCEH is looking to be a conduit to share the lessons that are being learned in Southeast Asia with scientists, agriculture officials and smallholder farmers in West Africa. Dr. Nicholas Cowan from UKCEH told us about the work they're doing in Africa, and we started with the history of farming palm there.
Oil palm does come from Africa, and at the moment maybe only about 10% of global production actually comes out of the continent today. If you go back to 1800s, kind of Industrial Revolution, West Africa is the only place growing oil palm, largely used for soaps and pharmaceuticals. But then early 1900s, some of those plants were taken to Malaysia and Indonesia, where the crop really flourished. If you come back to Africa, the crop is becoming more popular again. Demand is growing. We've seen a doubling of production in Africa across the past 20 years. You've got about 6 million hectares in 20 countries now across Africa, mostly in the West tropical region, where palm oil is largely exported from Southeast Asia in its refined form. What you get in Africa is more of a kind of dark red raw ingredient, and that's used directly in foods. And that Southeast Asia is producing on a massive scale for the global supply chain, refined oils for pharmaceuticals, for food products. So two very different environments for the supply chain now.
The expansion of oil palm is being limited in Southeast Asia. Does that mean it's an opportunity for Africa then?
There was backlash after so much destruction and now a moratorium. So both Indonesia and Malaysia have made it illegal to continue deforestation for oil palm. Because oil palm originated in Africa, it is seen as one location in which expansion can occur. But there are limitations. The environment's very different over in Africa. There's a lot less rainfall. Most of the land that can be used for oil palm growth is already being used by other crops or is under conservation itself. And you're also getting laws in Africa now, like Southeast Asia, that are preventing further deforestation because these countries in Africa don't want to repeat the same mistakes that were made in Malaysia and Indonesia when it comes to deforestation.
We heard from Neil and Yulia that most of the oil palm grown in Southeast Asia comes from these big corporations and there are fewer smallholders growing oil palm. Is that true in Africa as well?
In Africa, it's more like a 10-90 split where very few commercial estates run in Africa and almost all production is smallholder farmers. And there's multiple reasons for that. The primary one being that most of the farmable land in Africa is already owned largely at the village scale. And it's very difficult for a large corporation to come in and buy large swathes of land all connected, which is what a successful oil palm plantation requires. It requires a huge amount of land in one region with suitable conditions for the crop to encourage that kind of recycling and efficiency at the mill level. And that's not really feasible in West Africa.
How has UKCEH been involved in this in terms of discussions around the expansion, particularly of oil palm as a crop in Africa?
We want to help these smallholders improve their productivity of the crop, but not at the cost to the environment. So increasing productivity within the land that's already assigned and reducing the need for further deforestation. It means improving efficiency at the smallholder level in terms of both yield and oil processing. If you look at the mills in Africa, the smallholders will send them to local artisanal millers. they're half as productive as the commercial scale mills. So even if your farmers are very productive, you lose half the oil just because of bad milling processes. You have a lot more rot, you have a lot harder logistics for them to get through. And so you end up with waste at multiple levels. And that kind of fragmented system is a way that we can begin to target efficiencies and reduce the impact on the environment, and a kind of win-win situation for everyone there.
Are these the sort of issues that you discussed at a conference relatively recently in October?
At that workshop, we had local stakeholders, visitors from Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, scientists, policymakers, and various actors in the region. We discussed the smallholder issues, the challenges that they face, and how we can implement sustainable practices into farming in the region, especially for oil palm, and how we might better improve both the farmers' livelihoods and the environmental aspects. If you want to improve techniques and management, people need help, they need investment. That doesn't come easy when the family is living in poverty in these areas, and it's very much a kind of year-to-year survival. In Africa, though, you have fertilizer costs, for example, 4 times higher than they are in Southeast Asia. And that's just simply global economics, the cost of producing and transporting fertilizers to the region, and then the lack of logistics in the region once the fertilizers get there. If you combine that with the relatively low cost that they can get at the local market for their products, you tend to see that fertilizers cost more than the actual crops that they're growing. You also have the added danger of climate change, which is being felt in the region much more than it is in Southeast Asia. Oil palm is very sensitive to rainfall, and one drought, while it may not kill the plants, because the plants are quite drought resistant, can reduce yields by 20, 30, 40% for 2 or 3 years after.
What other ideas did you come up with to help the farmers?
Farmers in Africa need help when it comes to efficiency of the systems. What's become more prominent in Southeast Asia is you have cooperatives. The villagers can come together. They can begin purchasing their own equipment. They can start their own smaller scale mills. They can start recycling waste between different systems. They can start composting. They have a little bit more independence and a little bit more control of the supply chain. That helps them. It helps their livelihoods, but it also helps the environmental aspects. But you also have buying power, so they can sell higher and they can avoid losses in the system. That is one of the most important ways that we can help, is to demonstrate these community level initiatives and show the benefits, because the farmers don't want to take risk. If you can show that that works, then they're much more likely to engage because they'll see the benefit.
What do you think is the priority by many towards this issue? Is it about improving growing the local variety of oil palm in Africa, or is it about encouraging them to grow more of the high yield variety that's grown in Southeast Asia?
The researchers in West Africa are already providing seedlings for the Tenera variety, so the high-yielding oil variety. However, the smallholders aren't that keen on them. So although they know the oil yields are higher, the colour's not right, and the colour's what they get paid for at the markets, essentially. But in Africa, they're consuming 4 times more oil than they grow. So the demand there is still for the local popular red oil, especially in the smallholders. It's part of the tradition, and that's what they want. So even if you try and improve yields per se, it's not always going to improve profits. And so you have a real challenge there for people trying to improve the environmental aspects for oil palm. There's a lot of cultural things going on there as well.
All of the discussion in this podcast so far has been about how to overcome the challenges and finding the solutions to growing more oil palm. But in the West, it's seen as this tainted product because of all the deforestation and draining of peatlands that has happened to grow it, and because of the greenhouse gas emissions. So do we actually need more palm oil?
The reputation that palm oil has for destruction of rainforests in Southeast Asia is deserved. We can't reverse what's been done, at least not in the near term. The issue that we need to address now is more, how do we prevent further deforestation and habitat loss from palm oil production? The way that we think that we can move forward with that is improving the sustainability of oil palm, improving the methods that we use to grow it, improving the productivity that the smallholders have, decreasing the need for land for oil palm, and improving the productivity of the land that's already been converted. We can integrate what we think are the best practices with some kind of accreditation, something that the farmers can apply for, something that can be checked, something that gives them kind of certification that what they're doing is sustainable. Something that already exists is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil Production, the RSPO, and you will sometimes see those stickers on palm oil products. If that certification holds value with consumers, if people just don't boycott it, if people then think, no, I want this stuff rather than this stuff, give the value to the sustainable option, then you add value to that product. And then the industries start favouring that product, so the farmers start favouring that product. It benefits them, and that's what they'll move towards. That also gives us the option to include things like improving social issues. So things like workers' rights, things like fair trading policies, health and safety, social aspects of farming oil palm in these countries. That's something that science is helping to refine, pushing more and more towards sustainability to help farmers, not just to achieve them, but also to educate them, because the RSPO will educate farmers on what these thresholds are, how to achieve them. And if you do that, if you can accredit good practice and you can make it worth the farmer's while in these countries where most of them are living in poverty, fair trade really helps them in those regions, and that will push for change.
Our thanks to Dr. Nicholas Cowan from UKCEH. I always thought of palm oil as a problematic product, shall we say, but I can see now that it's much more complex. The push for greater sustainability in the industry is clearly vital. Only around 20% of global palm oil comes from sustainable sources, and we need to see that figure come up. We've mostly talked today about smallholders who are responsible for around 30% of global palm oil, but they of course face so many more challenges meeting the requirements of those certification schemes.
Their fragmented production chains, the admin involved in making their products traceable and demonstrating that they meet the scheme's conditions is tough, almost to impossible in some cases, for farmers with just a few tens of hectares. So the production models being operated by Wild Asia are extremely hopeful, and I can see how those kind of cooperative models could really work for the small farmers in Africa too. And the work UKCEH is doing with Wild Asia to trial various natural soil improvement methods is really vital.
This ambition of a near circular waste economy, efforts to enrich the biodiversity of these small plantations at all scales, is inspiring. I love the way Rachael was taking the lead from centuries-old methods of farming, and it'll be interesting to hear the results of the longer trials with biochar.
A clear message for all of us is to read labels and choose only those palm oil containing products that have sustainable certified palm oil. That's a change we can all make that will improve things across the world. Thank you for listening to our exploration of the quest for a more sustainable oil palm. We hope you'll join us next time for another look at nature through numbers.